in the year 1300, a man stood at the exact midpoint of his life. He was 35 years old, the age medieval scholars believed marked the halfway point of a human existence. He found himself lost in a dark wood, having strayed from the right path. And in that moment of existential terror, he would create the most vivid, influential, and enduring vision of the afterlife that Western civilization has ever known. This man was Dante Alighieri, and what he was about to write would change everything. Think about how you imagine hell. Close your eyes for a moment and picture it. You probably see circles descending into the earth. You imagine specific punishments tailored to specific sins. You envision demons operating according to strange rules, tormenting souls in ways that somehow fit their earthly crimes. You might see rivers of blood, or forests of suicide trees, or a frozen lake at the very bottom, where the worst betrayers are trapped in ice. Where did these images come from? They came from one man, writing in exile, nursing his wounds, turning his bitterness into the greatest poem ever written. Before Dante, hell was vague, undefined, more metaphor than place. After Dante, hell became architectural. He gave it geography, structure, rules. He made it real. But this is not just a story about hell. It's a story about how one bitter exile transformed personal suffering into universal truth. How a man who could never go home created a home for the human imagination. How someone who lost everything built something eternal from the ashes of his life. And it begins with understanding who Dante really was before he became the Dante of legend. Florence, in the late 13th century, was not a peaceful place. It was a city torn apart by political factions, where your family name could get you killed, where alliances shifted like sand, and where the price of being on the losing side was exile or death. Dante Alighieri was born into this chaos in 1265, into a minor noble family with enough status to matter, but not enough power to be safe. He grew up in a city that was simultaneously the most advanced and the most savage place in Europe. Florence was where modern banking was invented, where art and commerce flourished together, where the seeds of the Renaissance were already beginning to sprout. But it was also a city where political vendettas could span generations, where blood feuds were normal, where the streets could run red with the blood of rival factions. Dante's Florence was divided between the Guelphs and Ghibellines, supporters of the Pope and the Holy Roman Emperor respectively. But even within these factions were sub-factions. The Guelphs split into white Guelphs and black Guelphs, arguing over how much independence Florence should have from papal control. And Dante, because he was Dante, chose a side. He became a white Guelph. This was not just an abstract political position for him. In 1289, at age 24, he fought in the Battle of Campaldino, a brutal conflict where he saw death up close, where he understood viscerally what it meant to take a human life in the name of a cause. The experience marked him. He would later write about warriors in hell with their heads turned backwards, unable to see where they were going, a punishment that reflected the backward-looking nature of violence and vengeance. But Dante was not just a soldier. He was educated in the classical tradition, reading Virgil and other Latin poets, studying philosophy and theology. He was a member of the Florentine Guild of Physicians and Apothecaries, though he never practiced medicine. This was simply how one gained access to political office in Florence. You needed to belong to a guild. And Dante wanted to serve his city. He rose through the political ranks, eventually becoming one of the 6 priors of Florence in 1300, the very year he would later set his Divine Comedy. This was the peak of his worldly success. He was at the center of power in one of the most important cities in Europe. He had a wife, Gemma Donati, and children. He had property, respect, influence, and then it all came crashing down. In 1301, the Black Guelph seized power in Florence with the help of Pope Boniface VIII, whom Dante would later place in hell, stuffed upside down in a hole with his feet on fire. The Black Guelphs began a purge of their rivals. Dante was accused of corruption, of barratry, the selling of political offices. The charges were almost certainly fabricated. But truth didn't matter in the blood sport of Florentine politics. Dante was not in Florence when the accusations came. He was on a diplomatic mission to Rome, trying to negotiate with the very Pope who was betraying him. While he was away, the sentence was passed. If he returned to Florence, he would be burned alive. All his property was confiscated. His family was ruined. He was 36 years old, and his life as he knew it was over. He would never see Florence again. Think about what this means. Imagine being permanently exiled from your home city, from the only place you've ever belonged, under threat of death if you return. Imagine your property taken, your reputation destroyed, your family scattered. Imagine becoming a homeless wanderer, dependent on the charity of others, sleeping in other people's houses, eating at other people's tables, never belonging anywhere ever again. This is the man who wrote the Divine Comedy, a bitter exile, nursing his wounds, burning with resentment, but also reaching for something greater than revenge. He would spend the rest of his life wandering Italy, moving from patron to patron, city to city, never settling, never home. And in this state of permanent displacement, he would create the most complete vision of cosmic justice that literature has ever produced. The irony is almost too perfect. A man denied justice on earth creates the most elaborate system of divine justice in the afterlife. A man cast out of his home builds 3 entire realms, hell, purgatory, and heaven, where everyone finally gets what they deserve. A man who lost everything, material, creates something immortal and immaterial. But before we can understand his vision of hell, we need to understand the woman who made him believe in heaven. Dante met Beatrice Portinari when he was 9 years old, and she was 8. According to his own account in his earlier work, La Vita Nuova, The New Life, he saw her at a May Day celebration in Florence, and his entire world transformed. She was wearing a crimson dress. She greeted him politely, as children do. And in that moment, he tells us, Love himself appeared and claimed sovereignty over his soul. They barely spoke after that first meeting. He saw her again 9 years later, when they were both teenagers, and she greeted him on the street. That greeting sent him into raptures that lasted for days. He wrote poems about her. He idealized her. He built his entire interior life around this distant, barely known figure. Then she married another man, as was arranged by her family. And then, at age 24, she died. This is one of the strangest and most influential love stories in Western literature. Dante loved a woman he hardly knew. He created an entire theology of love around someone who barely acknowledged his existence. And when she died, instead of moving on, instead of treating it as the end of an adolescent infatuation, he transformed her into his guide through paradise, the embodiment of divine love, the bridge between earth and heaven. In the Divine Comedy, Beatrice is not a person anymore. She's an idea. She represents the possibility of redemption through love. She is what calls Dante back from the darkness, what sends Virgil to guide him through hell, what waits for him at the end of his journey. She is theology made flesh, or rather made spirit. But think about how strange this is. How many times did they actually speak? A handful at most. How well did he know her? Not at all, really. She was a construction of his imagination, a screen onto which he projected his highest aspirations and deepest longings. The real Beatrice Portinari, whoever she actually was, disappears entirely behind Dante's vision of what she represented. And yet, and this is the crucial point, This barely existent relationship became the emotional and spiritual center of one of the greatest works of literature ever written. Dante took something that barely existed in reality and made it eternal in art. He took a few childhood memories and a distant greeting and built from them a vision of divine love that has moved readers for 7 centuries. This tells us something essential about Dante. He had the ability to transform his personal experiences, no matter how limited or painful, into universal symbols. His exile became the soul's exile from God. His lost city became the lost paradise of Eden. His unrequited love became the love that moves the sun and other stars, as he puts it in the final line of the Paradiso. Everything in his life became material for the poem. His enemies ended up in hell. His friends appeared in purgatory. His teachers and guides showed up in heaven. The Divine Comedy is simultaneously a cosmic vision and a settling of scores, a theological treatise and a political manifesto, a journey through the afterlife, and a catalogue of Dante's grievances against everyone who wronged him. This is one of the most audacious things about the poem. Dante put real people into hell by name. Pope Boniface VIII, who betrayed him, Florentine politicians who exiled him, personal rivals who slighted him. He assigned them specific eternal punishments based on their sins. Imagine the nerve this takes. Imagine writing a poem where you condemn your enemies to hell forever, and then presenting this poem as divine revelation. But it worked. The poem was so powerful, so convincing, so detailed and complete in its vision, that people actually debated whether Dante had really visited hell. They took him seriously. His hell became the hell in Western imagination. And at the center of his vision of redemption, guiding him toward heaven, was a woman he barely knew, transformed into the incarnation of divine love. This is the mystery of Dante. He could take almost nothing and make it everything. A few childhood memories became eternal truth. A distant crush became the personification of grace. But to understand why his vision has such power, we need to understand the radical choice he made about how to tell this story. A choice that would change the course of literature and even create a language. In Dante's time, serious literature was written in Latin, period. If you wanted to write something important, something that would last, something that educated people would read and respect, you wrote it in the language of Rome, the language of the church, the language of scholarship and authority. Latin was the language of permanence. It was stable, unchanging, the same across all of Europe. It was the language of Virgil and Cicero, of St. Augustine and Thomas Aquinas. To write in Latin was to join the conversation of centuries, to participate in the great tradition of Western thought. Italian, or rather, the various local dialects that would eventually become Italian, was for everyday life. For commerce, for love songs, for street conversation. It was considered crude, unstable, temporary. Dialects varied from city to city. What they spoke in Florence was different from what they spoke in Venice or Naples. There was no standardized Italian language. There was no Italian literature, no Italian grammar, no sense that these local dialects could carry serious philosophical or theological weight. And Dante chose to write the Divine Comedy in Italian. This was radical. This was revolutionary. This was, in some ways, more shocking to his contemporaries than putting popes in hell. He took the most ambitious poem imaginable, a complete vision of the Christian afterlife, a synthesis of theology, philosophy, science, and politics, and he wrote it in the language of the streets. Why? He tells us himself in his unfinished Latin treatise, De Vulgari Eloquentia, on eloquence in the vernacular. He wanted to reach people who didn't know Latin. He wanted his poem to be read by ordinary educated Italians, not just clergy and scholars. He wanted to make high theology and classical learning accessible to anyone who could read. But there's more to it than that. Writing in Italian allowed him to do things that Latin couldn't do. It gave him flexibility, immediacy, rawness. He could use street slang for the damned in hell and elevated rhetoric for the blessed in heaven. He could mix registers, shift tones, move from the philosophical to the visceral and back again. Latin was too dignified, too formal, too constrained for what he wanted to do. And by choosing Italian, he effectively created the Italian language as a literary medium. Before Dante, there was no sense that Italian dialects could sustain a major work of literature. After Dante, the Tuscan dialect he used became the basis for standard Italian. He proved that the vernacular could carry the deepest truths of Christianity. He showed that you didn't need Latin to write something eternal. This single choice rippled through European literature for centuries. If Dante could write in Italian, why couldn't Chaucer write in English? Why couldn't Luther translate the Bible into German? The vernacular tradition in European literature arguably begins with Dante's decision to write his masterpiece in the language of his city. But there's a bitter irony here, of course. He wrote in Florentine Italian to honor his city, to make its dialect the vehicle for eternal truth, and Florence had exiled him. He was writing in the language of a home he could never return to. Every line of the Divine Comedy was written in the dialect of the city that had sentenced him to death. Think about that. The very language of the poem was a constant reminder of what he'd lost. Every word was an act of love and an act of pain. He was glorifying Florence by writing in its language while simultaneously putting its leaders in hell and imagining a cosmic justice that Florence itself had denied him. This is the paradox of Dante. His greatest act of revenge was also his greatest act of love. He condemned the Florence of his present while immortalizing the Florence of his memory. He cursed the politicians while celebrating the language. He was exiled from the earthly city, but created an eternal city in art. And the structure of that eternal city, the architecture of his hell, purgatory, and heaven, reveals something profound about how he understood the universe. Because the Divine Comedy isn't just poetry, it's a mathematical puzzle, a geometric proof, a cosmic blueprint built on sacred numbers. The Divine Comedy is built on the number 3 and its multiples. This is not accidental. This is not aesthetic preference. This is theology, disguised as mathematics, divine truth encoded in structure. 3 is the number of the Trinity, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. 3 is the number of theological virtues, faith, hope, and love. 3 is the number of perfection, of completion, of divine order. So Dante built everything on 3. The poem is divided into 3 parts: Inferno, Purgatorio, Paradiso. Each part has 33 cantos. Well, almost. The Inferno has 34, but that's because the first canto serves as a general introduction to the entire work. So each realm still gets its sacred 33. Add them up and you get 100 cantos total. 10 times 10, another perfect number. Each canto is written in terza rima, a rhyme scheme that Dante invented for this poem. It goes ABA, BCB, CDC, and so on, each stanza linked to the next in an endless chain. 3-line stanzas, interlocking forever, like the Trinity itself. 3 persons in one God, each distinct but inseparable from the others. Hell has 9 circles, plus the vestibule where the uncommitted souls reside. 9 is 3 times 3. Purgatory has 7 terraces for the 7 deadly sins, plus the Garden of Eden at the top. Heaven has 9 celestial spheres, plus the Empyrean, the dwelling place of God himself. Everything is measured, balanced, symmetrical. The poem is 14,023 lines long. It took Dante roughly 13 years to write, working on it throughout his exile until he finished it just before his death in 1321. Every word is placed with precision. Every image is calculated, every punishment in hell, every penance in purgatory, every joy in heaven reflects the numerical harmony of divine order. This mathematical structure serves multiple purposes. First, it reflects medieval theology's belief that God created the universe according to number, weight, and measure. The cosmos is ordered, not chaotic. Reality has structure. Mathematics reveals divine truth. Second, it creates a sense of inevitability and justice. Everything in Dante's afterlife happens for a reason. Every soul ends up in exactly the right place. The architecture is perfect. There are no accidents, no arbitrary punishments, no random assignments. If you're in the seventh circle of hell, there's a mathematical, theological, and moral logic to why you're there specifically. Third, and this is crucial, the mathematical structure makes the poem memorable. Medieval people memorized enormous amounts of text. They used memory palaces, architectural systems for storing information. Dante built a memory palace out of the afterlife. The numbered circles, the organized terraces, the structured spheres, these create a system you can navigate in your mind. The poem becomes a place you can visit in your imagination. But the most profound use of this mathematical structure is what it says about the relationship between poetry and truth. Dante believed that poetry was not just decoration or entertainment. Poetry was a way of knowing truth, of revealing reality, of accessing divine wisdom. The numerical perfection of his poem wasn't just aesthetic, it was epistemological. The form embodied the truth it was trying to convey. Think about what this means. Dante thought he was doing theology, not just writing fiction. He believed that by constructing a mathematically perfect vision of the afterlife, he was revealing something true about how God actually organized creation. The poem was not an invention, it was a discovery. This is why he presents himself as a character in his own poem, being guided through the afterlife by Virgil and Beatrice. He's not making this up. He's reporting what he saw. Of course, he knows it's a vision, a poetic vision. But that doesn't make it less true. Poetry, for Dante, could convey truths that philosophy couldn't reach and theology couldn't fully express. The Divine Comedy is many things: epic poem, political satire, personal confession, theological treatise, revenge fantasy. But it's also this, an attempt to save souls through art. Dante genuinely believed that his poem could guide people towards salvation, not just metaphorically, actually. He thought that reading his description of hell would frighten people away from sin, that reading about purgatory would teach them how to repent, that reading about heaven would kindle their love for God. Poetry, for Dante, was a moral and spiritual tool. The beauty of his verse, the precision of his imagery, the perfection of his structure, all of this served a redemptive purpose. He was trying to help his readers get to heaven. And the way he tried to do this was by showing them, in the most vivid possible detail, what happens to souls after death. Starting with hell. Starting with the architecture of damnation. Picture a vast funnel descending into the earth. At the top, the widest part, are the least serious sinners. As you go down, the circles narrow and the sins get worse. At the very bottom, at the narrowest point, in a frozen lake, is Satan himself. This is Dante's hell. It's not fire and brimstone everywhere. It's not demons randomly torturing people. It's an organized, rational, carefully structured system where the punishment always fits the crime. This is called contrapasso, the idea that your eternal punishment should mirror your earthly sin in some meaningful way. Let's descend through the circles and see how this works. The poem begins with Dante lost in a dark wood, having strayed from the right path. He's 35, midway through life, and he's lost. This is not just geographical disorientation. This is spiritual crisis. He's wandered away from God without quite realizing how far he's gone. He tries to climb a sunlit hill, the mountain of salvation, but three beasts block his way. A leopard representing fraud, a lion representing violence, and a she-wolf representing incontinence or uncontrolled desire. These are the three categories of sin he'll encounter in hell. He can't get past them on his own. Then Virgil appears. The great Roman poet, author of the Aeneid, sent by Beatrice to guide Dante through hell and purgatory. Why Virgil? Because he represents the highest achievement of human reason without divine revelation. He's as far as natural wisdom can take you. But he can't guide Dante to heaven. That requires grace, which Beatrice represents. They enter hell through a gate that bears the famous inscription, "Abandon all hope, you who enter here." This isn't just a warning to the damned, it's a statement about the nature of hell itself. Hell is the place where hope is impossible, not because God is cruel, but because the damned have made final choices. They chose their sins. They refused repentance. They died in a state of rejection of God, and now, forever, they live with the consequences. The first area inside hell is the vestibule, where the uncommitted souls reside. These are the people who never took a stand for anything. They weren't evil enough to deserve the lower circles, but they weren't good enough to be saved. They lived for themselves, neutral in the great moral struggles, neither hot nor cold. Now they run forever after a blank banner, chasing something meaningless, while wasps and hornets sting them, and their blood feeds the worms at their feet. They chose to live for nothing, so they chase nothing forever. Then they cross the river Acheron and enter the first circle, limbo. This is where virtuous pagans reside, people who lived good lives but died before Christ or without baptism. Virgil himself is here, along with great philosophers and poets, Aristotle, Plato, Homer, Ovid. They're not tortured, but they can never reach heaven because they lack the grace that faith provides. They dwell in a noble castle, civilized and dignified, but separated from God forever. This is one of Dante's most interesting theological moves. He can't accept that good people deserve torture just because they were born in the wrong place or time. But he also can't abandon the Christian teaching that salvation requires Christ. So he creates this intermediate space where the virtuous pagans suffer only the pain of knowing they can never reach their full potential, never see God face to face. Now we descend into the real hell, where active sins are punished. The second circle is for the lustful, those who let sexual passion override their reason. They're blown about forever in a dark whirlwind, just as they let passion blow them through life. Dante meets Paolo and Francesca here, lovers who committed adultery and were murdered together. Their story is tragic, romantic, moving. Dante is so overcome with pity that he faints. But they're still in hell. Love without virtue, passion without restraint, even when it seems beautiful, leads to damnation. The third circle holds the gluttons, those who live for food and drink. They lie in mud under freezing rain, guarded by Cerberus, the three-headed dog. They consumed without thought, now they're consumed by filth. They made their belly their god, now they wallow in garbage forever. The fourth circle contains the hoarders and wasters, those who either clutched money too tightly or threw it away too carelessly. They roll giant boulders at each other, crashing together, then rolling their burdens back to crash again. They fought over money in life. They fight over meaningless stones forever. Now we cross the river Styx into the fifth circle, where the wrathful and sullen are punished. The wrathful fight each other on the surface of the muddy river, tearing at each other's flesh. The sullen are trapped beneath the surface, bubbling, unable to express even their misery clearly. They let anger control them in life. Now, anger is all they have. We reach the walls of the city of Dis, the lower hell, where worse sins are punished. Heretics are here, trapped in burning tombs, unable to see the present because they chose wrong ideas about the future. Their pride in their own intellect led them to deny truth. Now they're buried in their own dead certainty. The seventh circle is for the violent, divided into 3 rings. Those violent against neighbors wade in a river of boiling blood. Those violent against themselves, the suicides, are transformed into thorny trees, pecked at by harpies. They destroyed their own bodies. Now they can't have bodies at all. Those violent against God, nature, or art are trapped on burning sand under a rain of fire. The 8th circle, the Malibulge, the evil ditches, is for fraud. It's divided into 10 concentric ditches, each for a different type of fraud. Pandarers and seducers are whipped by demons. Flatterers are immersed in excrement. Simoniacs, those who sold church offices, are planted upside down in holes with their feet on fire. Sorcerers and fortune-tellers have their heads turned backwards so they can only see behind them. They tried to see the future, now they can only see the past. Berators, corrupt politicians like Dante himself was accused of being, are plunged in boiling pitch. Hypocrites walk forever in lead robes gilded on the outside. They appeared golden, but were heavy with falseness. Now they wear that weight literally. Thieves are attacked by serpents, constantly transforming, losing their human form because they stole others' property. Evil counselors are wrapped in flames. Ulysses is here, punished not for the deeds in Homer, but for the pride that made him sail beyond the boundaries of the known world. Sowers of discord are hacked apart by a demon, their bodies constantly splitting and reforming. They divided communities, now they're divided forever. And falsifiers suffer various diseases. Alchemists are covered in leprosy, counterfeiters blowed with dropsy, perjurers burn with fever. They corrupted truth, now they're corrupted in body. Finally, we reach the 9th circle, the lowest part of hell, reserved for traitors. And here, everything we expect about hell is overturned, because it's not hot, it's frozen. Frozen solid in a lake of ice called Cocytus. At the very bottom of hell, where you expect raging fires and unbearable heat, Dante gives us ice, absolute cold, frozen stillness. This is his most brilliant reimagining of hell, and it tells us everything about what he thinks evil really is. The 9th circle is divided into 4 regions, all within the frozen lake of Cocytus. Each region is named after famous traitors from classical and biblical history. Caina, named after Cain who killed his brother, holds traitors to family. They're frozen up to their necks, their faces turned down. They betrayed the most fundamental bond, the bond of blood. Now they can't even look at each other. Antenora, named after Antenor who betrayed Troy, holds traitors to country or party. They're frozen in the same position but can move their heads. Dante finds Bocca degli Abati here, a Florentine who betrayed his own side in battle. When Bocca refuses to tell his name, Dante grabs him by the hair and pulls out a chunk of it. This is personal. This is revenge. Traitors to Florence are traitors to Dante. Ptolemaea, named after Ptolemy who murdered his guests, holds traitors to guests and hosts. They're frozen on their backs, their tears freezing over their eyes, creating masks of ice. They violated sacred hospitality. Now they can't even cry properly. And here Dante makes a shocking claim. Some souls fall to hell before they're physically dead. Their bodies are still walking around on earth, possessed by demons, while their souls are already damned. This is how he explains traitors who haven't died yet. They're already in hell. They're just still wearing their bodies. And finally, Judaica, named after Judas Iscariot who betrayed Christ, holds traitors to benefactors. These are the worst sinners of all, people who betrayed those who loved and helped them. They're completely submerged in ice, visible like straws in glass, frozen in all possible positions. No movement, no speech, no contact with anything. absolute isolation, and at the center of Judaica, in the center of the frozen lake, in the center of hell itself, at the absolute bottom of the universe, is Satan. But this is not the Satan you expect. This is not the proud fallen angel, the master of hell, the powerful adversary of God. This is the most pathetic creature in all of creation. Dante's Satan is a grotesque parody of the Trinity. He has three faces, one red, one black, one pale yellow, representing hatred, ignorance, and impotence. Three heads on one body, a mockery of three persons in one God. From each face he weeps constantly. From each mouth he chews a traitor. In the center mouth is Judas Iscariot, who betrayed Christ. In the other two mouths are Brutus and Cassius, who betrayed Julius Caesar. And Satan is stuck. He's frozen from the waist down in the ice. His 6 bat-like wings flap constantly, trying to escape, but the wind from his wings just freezes the lake harder. He's making his own prison worse. He's trapped in the consequences of his own actions forever. Think about this image. The most evil being in the universe is not powerful. He's not frightening. He's pitiable. He's stuck, crying, making his situation worse, unable to do anything but chew on traitors forever. This is Dante's ultimate vision of evil. It's not hot passion or violent energy. It's cold. It's frozen. It's isolated. It's impotent. Evil is the absence of love, the absence of connection, the absence of movement toward God. It's being utterly alone, utterly stuck, utterly unable to change or grow or escape. Hell, at its deepest point, is not about torture inflicted from outside. It's about the natural consequence of choosing yourself over everything else, until you're left with nothing but yourself, frozen, alone, forever. And here's the brilliant part. To escape hell, Dante and Virgil have to climb down Satan's body. They climb down his fur, and at a certain point they have to flip around because they passed the center of the earth. They're no longer climbing down, they're climbing up. Satan marks the absolute bottom, the point where down becomes up, and on the other side, they emerge and they see the stars. The journey through hell ends not with fire but with ice, not with Satan as a powerful enemy, but as a frozen, weeping prisoner. And the escape from hell requires passing through the very center of evil to reach the other side. This is the cosmological structure of Dante's universe. Hell is a pit descending into the earth, created when Satan fell from heaven. Mount Purgatory is on the opposite side of the earth, created by the displaced earth from hell's creation. And above Purgatory are the spheres of heaven ascending to God. But before we climb Mount Purgatory or rise through heaven, we need to understand what Dante thought his poem could actually accomplish. Because he didn't write it just to describe hell, he wrote it to save souls. Dante believed that poetry was not mere entertainment or aesthetic pleasure. Poetry was a tool for moral and spiritual transformation. The Divine Comedy was meant to frighten people away from sin, teach them how to repent, and inspire them to love God. It was missionary work disguised as art. It was theology that worked on the emotions and imagination, not just on reason. Think about how different this is from our modern understanding of literature. We read novels and poems for pleasure, for insight, for beauty. We might learn something or feel something, but we don't usually expect literature to change our moral character or determine our eternal destiny. Art is art. Religion is religion. We keep them separate. Dante wouldn't understand this separation. For him, the truest art was religious art. The most beautiful poetry was poetry that pointed toward God. And the purpose of creating such beauty was not just to please readers, but to transform them, to move them, quite literally, from sin toward salvation. This is why the punishments in hell are so vivid, so visceral, so disturbing. Dante wants you to feel the horror. He wants you to imagine yourself in boiling blood, or frozen in ice, or transformed into a tree. He wants you to understand emotionally and imaginatively what it means to sin. Not in abstract theological terms, but in concrete, embodied, unforgettable images. When you read about Paolo and Francesca, the adulterous lovers blown forever in the dark wind, you're supposed to think about lust differently, not as romantic passion, but as a force that destroys you, that takes away your agency, that leaves you forever blown about by forces you can't control. The beauty of their story makes it more powerful, not less. You feel the tragedy. You understand why Dante faints with pity. But you also understand that pity doesn't change their damnation. Love without virtue is still sin. When you read about Pier della Vigna, the advisor to Emperor Frederick II who committed suicide after being falsely accused, you're supposed to think about despair differently. He's transformed into a thorny tree. When Dante breaks off a branch, it bleeds and speaks. The horror of that image, the violation of taking a human soul and making it vegetable, unable to move or act or even maintain human form. This is supposed to make you understand the gravity of destroying yourself. It's supposed to make suicide not just wrong, but viscerally, imaginatively unbearable. Every punishment in hell is designed to be memorable and morally instructive. The contrapasso, the fitting of punishment to sin, makes you think about sin differently. You see the logical consequence of each vice. You understand how sins that seem minor or even attractive in life lead to horrible outcomes in eternity. But Dante doesn't stop with fear. Fear might drive you away from sin, but it won't save you. You also need to know how to repent, how to change, how to purify yourself. That's what purgatory is for. Purgatory is where souls go who died in a state of grace, but still need to be cleansed of their attachment to sin. And purgatory, in Dante's vision, is not another version of hell. It's fundamentally different. It's a place of hope. The souls there are suffering, yes, but they're suffering by choice, willingly, because they want to be purified. They want to become capable of seeing God. Their suffering has meaning and an endpoint. It's transformative, not punitive. Purgatory is a mountain that rises from the ocean on the opposite side of the earth from Jerusalem. At its base is the shore where souls arrive after death. Around the base is the terrace of the excommunicated and the late repentant, souls who have to wait before they can begin climbing. Then there are 7 terraces, one for each of the 7 deadly sins: pride, envy, wrath, sloth, avarice, gluttony, and lust. The souls climb the mountain, stopping at each terrace to purge themselves of that particular sin. And the punishments, or rather penances, here also follow the pattern of contrapasso, but differently than in hell. In hell, the punishment is eternal and reflects the nature of the sin. In purgatory, the penance is temporary and is designed to teach the opposite virtue. The proud carry heavy stones on their backs, forced to walk bent over, learning humility. The envious have their eyes sewn shut, learning to not covet what others have. The wrathful walk in blinding smoke, learning patience. The slothful run constantly, learning zeal. The avaricious and prodigal lie face down on the ground, unable to see the sky, learning detachment from earthly goods. The gluttonous are tormented by hunger and thirst inside of food they can't reach, learning temperance. And the lustful walk through fire, learning to control passion. But here's the key difference from hell. These souls are purging themselves willingly. They could refuse, they could stop climbing, but they don't, because they want to be worthy of heaven. They sing hymns, they encourage each other. They explain their sins to Dante, not with despair, but with hope. We're here because we chose wrong, but we're climbing toward God, and eventually we'll make it. At the top of Mount Purgatory is the Garden of Eden, the earthly paradise, where Adam and Eve lived before the fall. This is where Virgil leaves Dante. Virgil can't go higher because he's not baptized, because he lived before Christ. But he's guided Dante as far as human reason can go. Now Dante needs divine revelation. And here, in the Garden of Eden, Beatrice appears. Not the historical Beatrice who barely knew him, but Beatrice as theology, as grace, as the love that moves the stars. She scolds Dante for his sins. She makes him confess. She makes him look at himself honestly. And only after this confession and repentance can she guide him through paradise. This is Dante's vision of the spiritual journey. You start lost in the dark wood, unable to save yourself. Reason, represented by Virgil, can guide you through the recognition of sin and the beginning of repentance. But reason alone can't get you to heaven. You need grace, you need love, you need something beyond yourself. And then, with Beatrice as his guide, Dante rises through the 9 celestial spheres toward the Empyrean, the dwelling place of God. Here's where Dante faces his greatest artistic challenge. Hell is easy to make interesting. Suffering is dramatic. Evil is fascinating. Horror captures attention. Even purgatory has narrative tension, the climb, the struggle, the progress toward a goal. But paradise, how do you make perfect happiness interesting? How do you describe eternal bliss without boring your reader? How do you show souls in heaven without making them seem bland or their joy seem monotonous? Dante's solution is to make paradise about knowledge and love. The souls in heaven don't sit on clouds playing harps. They rise through spheres of increasing light and increasing understanding. Each sphere reveals more of God's nature. Each level brings the souls closer to the source of all being, truth, and beauty. The structure of paradise mirrors medieval cosmology. Earth is at the center. Around it rotate 9 celestial spheres: the moon, Mercury, Venus, the sun, Mars, Jupiter, Saturn, the fixed stars, and the primum mobile, the first mover. Beyond these is the Empyrean, which is not a physical place but pure light, pure intellect, pure love, the dwelling place of God. As Dante rises through these spheres with Beatrice, he meets souls who appear in different spheres, not because they're separated by rank. Everyone in heaven sees God, but because they represent different types of virtue or different levels of understanding for Dante's education. In the sphere of the moon, he meets souls who broke their vows. They're happy, but they help Dante understand that every soul in heaven is completely satisfied because they see God according to their capacity, and their capacity is exactly what God made it to be. There's no envy in heaven because everyone is full of joy. In Mercury are souls who did good works for fame. In Venus are lovers, but now their love is purified and directed toward God. In the sun are wise theologians and doctors of the church, including Thomas Aquinas, who explains the nature of wisdom. In Mars are holy warriors. In Jupiter are just rulers. In Saturn are contemplatives who spent their lives in prayer. As Dante rises higher, the light becomes brighter, the understanding deeper, the joy more intense. Beatrice becomes more beautiful at each level because she's reflecting more of God's light. Dante's own capacity for understanding increases. He can see more, comprehend more, love more. But there's a problem. How can Dante describe what he's seeing when it's beyond human language? How can he explain joy that surpasses all earthly joy? How can he convey understanding that transcends rational thought? He does it through paradox, through imagery that breaks down, through admissions of failure. The higher he goes, the more he has to say, "I can't describe this." The limitations of language become part of the experience. Heaven is not just hard to describe, it's impossible to describe. You can only point at it with metaphors that collapse under their own inadequacy. In the sphere of the fixed stars, Dante is examined on faith, Hope, and Love by Saints Peter, James, and John. This is his final test before he can approach the vision of God himself. And the questions aren't theoretical, they're existential. What is faith? What does he hope for? What is the nature of love? His answer on love is the climax of the poem's intellectual journey. Love, he says, is what moves all things toward their proper end. The love that moves the stars is the same love that should move human hearts. All creation is drawn toward God by love. Sin is misdirected love, love of the wrong things, or love of the right things in the wrong way. Salvation is rightly ordered. Love, loving God above all, and all other things in God. Then he passes into the primum mobile, the fastest moving sphere, and from there into the empyrean. And here language really does fail. He sees God. He sees the divine light. He sees the Trinity. He sees how the divine and human are united in Christ. He sees how free will and divine providence can both be true. He sees how multiplicity emerges from unity and returns to unity, but he can't describe it except in the most abstract terms. Light, love, circles. 3 circles of 3 colors in one. He grasps it for a moment, and then the vision fades, and he's left with the memory of understanding without being able to retain the understanding itself. And the poem ends with one of the most beautiful lines in literature. But already my desire and my will were being turned like a wheel, all at one speed, by the love that moves the sun and the other stars. He's been transformed. His will is now aligned with divine love. He's no longer lost in the dark wood. He's found his way home, not to Florence, which he can never return to, but to God, which is the only home that matters. This is what Dante wants for his readers, not just to hear about heaven, but to desire it, not just to understand the theology, but to feel the pull of that love. The poem is meant to do to you what the journey did to Dante: transform your desires, reorder your loves, turn your will toward God. And he believed it could work. He believed that poetry, real poetry, beautiful and true poetry, had the power to save souls. Not mechanically, not magically, but by working on the imagination and emotions in ways that reason alone could not. Whether he was right about that, we can debate. But there's no debating that his poem changed literature forever, and it's time we understood how. Before Dante, hell was vague. Biblical descriptions are sparse and metaphorical. Fire and darkness, weeping and gnashing of teeth, a place of punishment, but no clear structure, no specific torments, no organized system. The Church Fathers and medieval theologians developed more detailed ideas. Augustine wrote about hell as separation from God. Thomas Aquinas wrote about the pain of loss and the pain of sense. There were theories about different levels of punishment for different sins, but nothing concrete, nothing visual, nothing you could picture. Then Dante built hell like an architect. 9 circles, each with its own geography, its own rivers, its own demons, its own rules. He gave it structure. He gave it logic. He made it a place you could map, a place you could visit in your imagination, a place that felt real. And his hell became the hell for Western culture. When people today imagine hell, they're imagining Dante's version, whether they know it or not. The idea that hell is divided into levels of increasing punishment. The idea that different sins get different torments. The idea that the punishment fits the crime. The visual imagery of rivers of blood, forests of suicides, frozen traitors, all Dante. He invented the modern iconography of hell. Artists painting hell, after Dante painted Dante's hell. Writers describing hell after Dante described Dante's hell. Even people who never read the Divine Comedy have absorbed Dante's vision through cultural osmosis. This is one of the most remarkable achievements in literature. One man, working alone in exile, created a vision so powerful that it replaced all previous visions. He out-imagined everyone else so completely that his imagination became reality for Western culture. But it's not just the structure of hell that Dante invented. It's the whole idea of hell as a place of poetic justice, where the punishment reveals the nature of the sin. This is not in the Bible. It's not in church tradition. It's Dante's innovation. Think about the suicide forest. The idea that people who destroyed their own bodies would be trapped in tree bodies, unable to move, unable to act, subject to violation by birds and other creatures. This is pure Dante. It's brilliant. It's horrifying. It makes you understand what self-destruction means in a way that abstract theological arguments never could. Or the fortune tellers, with their heads turned backwards, able to see only behind them because they tried to see the future. Or the hypocrites in lead robes gilded on the outside. Or the simoniacs planted upside down in holes with their feet on fire. Every image teaches a moral lesson through its very form. This is Dante's genius. He doesn't just tell you that sins are punished. He shows you how the form of punishment reveals the essence of the sin. He makes you see that sin carries its punishment within itself. You don't need an external torturer. The sin itself, extended into eternity, becomes the torture. The lustful are blown by winds because they let passion blow them through life. The violent against neighbors wade in blood because they spilled blood. The fraudulent are trapped in ditches because they dug ditches for others. The traitors are frozen because they were cold-hearted. The logic is inescapable. And this logic, this sense that hell is not arbitrary, but just, not cruel, but rational, this made Dante's hell believable. It made it feel true. Even if you don't believe in hell literally, you recognize the psychological truth in Dante's vision. Sin does trap you. Vice does deform the soul. Choosing wrongly does have consequences that fit the nature of the choice. So Dante's hell became the cultural standard, not because the church mandated it, not because it was biblically accurate, but because it was psychologically and morally convincing. It felt right. It made sense. It revealed truth about human nature and moral consequences. And once that vision took hold, it was almost impossible to dislodge. Milton wrote Paradise Lost centuries later and had to work within the framework Dante established. Blake drew hell based on Dante's structure. Joyce built Ulysses as a modern version of Dante's journey. Eliot's Wasteland is saturated with Dante references. Contemporary writers still can't describe hell without referencing Dante. He didn't just write about hell, he created it. And in creating it, he created one of the most powerful tools for moral education the Western culture has ever known. But there's something else Dante did that's equally important and often overlooked. He made hell literary revenge. Dante put his enemies in hell, by name, with specific punishments. This is not subtle. This is not metaphorical. He condemned real people to eternal damnation in his poem and described their suffering in detail. Pope Boniface VIII, who orchestrated Dante's Exile, is in the 8th circle among the simoniacs, corrupt church officials who sold sacred things for money. Dante meets him upside down in a hole, his feet on fire, and Dante doesn't even express pity. He condemns the Pope's greed and corruption. This is a man taking revenge on the head of the church through poetry. Filippo Argenti, a political enemy from Florence, is in the 5th circle among the wrathful, fighting in the muddy river Styx. When Dante sees him, he actually celebrates. He wants to see Argenti suffer more. Virgil approves. This is personal hatred given eternal form. Bocca degli Abati, who betrayed the Florentines at the Battle of Montaperti, is frozen in ice among the traitors. When Dante discovers who he is, he grabs Bocca's hair and rips some out, refusing to show mercy or pity. This is brutal, visceral revenge. Count Ugolino, who was locked in a tower with his sons and grandsons and left to starve, is frozen in the ice, eternally gnawing on the skull of Archbishop Alighieri, the man who betrayed him. Ugolino tells Dante his story in one of the most horrific passages in the poem. His children begging for food, him watching them die one by one. Then the suggestion never quite stated that he might have eaten their bodies, and now for eternity he eats Ruggieri's head. This is literature as revenge. This is a poet using his art to settle scores, and it's breathtakingly audacious. Imagine doing this. Imagine writing a poem where you put everyone who wronged you in hell, gave them specific eternal punishments, and then presented this poem as divinely inspired truth. Imagine claiming that you're not making this up. You're reporting what God showed you. Imagine the nerve. But it worked. It worked because Dante's hell was so convincing, so well constructed, so morally coherent that people took it seriously. They debated whether Dante had really visited hell. They argued about whether specific people deserved their punishments. The poem was so powerful that it created a kind of alternate reality, where Dante's judgments became, in the cultural imagination, almost as real as actual theological judgments. This is the ultimate power of art. Dante couldn't get political justice. Florence wouldn't reverse his exile. He couldn't punish his enemies in the real world. But he could punish them in art. He could create a vision so compelling that for centuries, people would remember Pope Boniface VIII primarily for being upside down in Dante's hell with his feet on fire. Think about that. Boniface was one of the most powerful men in Europe. He claimed authority over kings and emperors. He shaped the medieval church, but his historical legacy is now inseparable from Dante's condemnation. The exile punished the Pope using only words. This is what literature can do. It can't change the past. It can't reverse injustice. But it can shape memory. It can create narratives that outlast physical power. Dante lost every earthly thing. But he won immortality. And in winning immortality, he gave immortality to his enemies. Immortality as villains in the greatest poem ever written. But Dante didn't just use his poem for revenge. He also used it for love, for honoring what he valued, for immortalizing what he cherished. And this brings us back to Beatrice. In the architecture of the Divine Comedy, Beatrice is not just Dante's guide to paradise, she's the reason he saved it all. The poem begins with Dante lost in the dark wood. He tries to climb toward the light, but can't get past the three beasts. He's about to give up, about to fall back into the darkness. Then Virgil appears and tells him that Beatrice sent him. Beatrice, now in heaven, saw that Dante was in danger. She left paradise, descended to limbo, found Virgil, and begged him to save Dante. She's the one who initiates the entire journey. Without her intervention, Dante would have been lost. Think about the layers of meaning here. Beatrice, the woman he barely knew in life, becomes his savior after death. His distant crush becomes the instrument of divine grace. His unrequited love becomes the love that redeems him. This is Dante taking the most painful, unfulfilled aspect of his emotional life and transforming it into the center of his salvation. He loved a woman who didn't love him back. She married someone else. She died young. By any normal measure, this is a story of loss and disappointment. But Dante refuses that narrative. Instead, he claims that this love, precisely because it was unfulfilled, precisely because it remained pure and idealized, pointed him toward God. He loved Beatrice, not for sexual gratification or earthly companionship, but for her spiritual beauty, her goodness, her reflection of divine truth. And that kind of love doesn't die with the beloved. It transcends death. It becomes eternal. So in the poem, Beatrice is alive, more alive in heaven than she ever was on earth. And her love for Dante, which barely existed in life, becomes the force that saves him. She intervenes, she sends Virgil, she waits for him in paradise, she guides him to God. When Dante finally sees Beatrice in the Garden of Eden at the top of Mount Purgatory, it's one of the most emotionally complex scenes in literature. She's beautiful beyond description, but she's not gentle. She scolds him. She demands that he confess his sins. She makes him acknowledge that after her death, he turned away from her memory, followed false images, loved earthly things. She's not the romantic heroine who forgives everything. She's a stern teacher who demands accountability. And Dante weeps. He admits his failures. He confesses that he strayed. Only after this confession can she smile at him. Only after he acknowledges his sins can she guide him higher. This is love as transformation, not as comfort. Beatrice doesn't exist to make Dante feel good about himself. She exists to make him better, to purify him, to lead him to God. Her love is tough love, holy love, the kind that demands change. And as they rise through paradise, Beatrice becomes more beautiful at each level because she's reflecting more of God's light. She's not a woman anymore, or not only a woman, she's theology, she's grace. She's the principle that mediates between the human and divine. But here's the paradox. The more theological Beatrice becomes, the more we understand what Dante actually loved about the historical Beatrice. He didn't love her for her personality or her body or her wit. He loved her because she pointed him toward transcendence. She was, for him, a window into the divine. And that's why her death didn't end his love. If anything, it purified his love, freed it from earthly complications, allowed it to become what it always was meant to be, a path to God. This is Dante's answer to the problem of unfulfilled love. Don't grieve it as a loss. Transform it into a spiritual opportunity. Love that can't be consummated on earth can be consummated in heaven. Desire that can't be satisfied by the beloved can be satisfied by God. The longing itself, if rightly directed, becomes the path to salvation. It's a beautiful idea. It's also, frankly, a bit maddening. Dante took a woman who barely knew him, made her the center of his spiritual universe, claimed her as his savior, and then used her memory to guide himself to God. The real Beatrice Portinari disappears entirely in this process. She becomes a symbol, a function, a theological principle. But this is what Dante does to everything in his life. He transforms it. He takes the raw material of experience, pain, loss, love, exile, and he turns it into art that claims to reveal eternal truth. And nowhere is this transformation more complete than in his treatment of language itself. Dante wrote the Divine Comedy in Tuscan Italian at a time when there was no such thing as a standard Italian language. The peninsula was divided into dozens of city-states, each with its own dialect. What they spoke in Florence was different from Venetian, from Neapolitan, from Sicilian. These weren't just accents. They were mutually unintelligible languages. Latin was the language of unity. Latin was what educated people used to communicate across regional boundaries. Latin was stable, unchanging, prestigious. If you wanted to write something important, you wrote it in Latin. Dante chose not to. And in choosing not to, he effectively created literary Italian. His Tuscan dialect became the basis for the standard Italian language, because his poem was so influential that people wanted to read it, wanted to imitate it, wanted to write in the language he used. This is an almost unimaginable achievement. Imagine writing something so good that it creates a national language. Imagine your poem being the reason millions of people speak the way they do. But Dante didn't do this by accident or even by pure literary genius. He thought very carefully about the choice to write in the vernacular. He even started writing a Latin treatise called De Vulgari Eloquentia, on eloquence in the vernacular, where he defended the use of Italian for serious literature. His argument was democratic and radical. Latin was for the educated elite. But truth, beauty, and divine wisdom shouldn't be limited to people who can read Latin. They should be accessible to anyone who can read their own language. The vernacular could carry high ideas. It could be made eloquent. It could bear the weight of theology and philosophy. More than that, the vernacular was alive. Latin was dead, frozen, unchanging. But Italian was growing, evolving, flexible. You could do things in Italian that you couldn't do in Latin. You could be more immediate, more emotional, more varied in your tone and register. Dante proved this by writing in multiple registers. In hell, demons use crude language, almost vulgar. Damned souls speak in their regional dialects. There's even a passage where a demon makes a crude gesture and farts at the other demons. This is low, comic, visceral language. But in paradise, the language becomes elevated, abstract, filled with light imagery and theological terminology. Dante stretches Italian to its limits, trying to describe the indescribable. He invents new words. He creates compound constructions. He pushes syntax in ways Italian had never been pushed before. And in between, in purgatory, the language is human, conversational, filled with the speech of souls who are learning to speak rightly, to use language as praise rather than complaint. This range, this flexibility, this ability to be both vulgar and sublime, this is what makes the Divine Comedy work. And it's only possible in the vernacular. Latin would have been too constrained, too dignified, too uniform. So Dante's choice to write in Italian wasn't just a political statement, though it was that. It was an artistic necessity. The poem required a living language that could stretch to contain everything he wanted to say, and the result was that Tuscan Italian became the literary standard for Italy. Later writers, Petrarch, Boccaccio, wrote in Tuscan because Dante had shown it could be done. The language spread. Other dialects began to seem provincial. By the Renaissance, Dante's Italian was being taught as the model for all Italian literature. He created a language by using it so well that everyone else wanted to use it too. This is soft power at its most extreme. He couldn't conquer Florence with armies. He couldn't regain his position through politics. But he conquered Italian literature with words. He made his city's dialect immortal, even though his city exiled him. The irony is perfect and painful. Florence rejected Dante. But Dante made Florence's language the language of Italian culture. He gave them an eternal gift while they gave him exile and threats of death. And he never forgave them. And he never stopped loving them. This is the paradox of Dante. His greatest revenge was his greatest act of love. His bitterness and his devotion were two sides of the same coin, which brings us to the final paradox. The man who never went home. Dante died in Ravenna in 1321, still in exile, still banned from Florence under penalty of death. He was 56 years old. He had spent the last 20 years of his life wandering from city to city, dependent on the charity of various patrons, never settling, never belonging. The Divine Comedy was complete. He had finished it just before his death. He had created the most comprehensive poetic vision of Christian cosmology ever written. He had built 3 entire realms and populated them with hundreds of characters. He had synthesized theology, philosophy, astronomy, physics, politics, and personal history into a single unified work of art. And he had done all of this while homeless, while bitter, while nursing his wounds, while burning with resentment against the city that exiled him. He never saw Florence again. And Florence, in one of history's great acts of institutional stubbornness, never rescinded his exile. Not during his lifetime, not after his death, not even centuries later when they realized what they had lost. Today, Dante's bones rest in Ravenna, in a modest tomb near the church of San Francesco. Florence has been asking for them back for centuries. They built an empty tomb for him in the Basilica of Santa Croce. They've apologized for the exile. They've claimed him as their greatest son, but Ravenna refuses. They say Florence had its chance. Dante died in Ravenna. He's staying in Ravenna. If Florence wanted him, they shouldn't have exiled him. This is both petty and profoundly fitting. Dante remains in exile even in death. The city he loved, the city he wrote in the language of, the city he immortalized in his poem, still can't have him back. The exile is permanent. The separation is eternal. But here's the deeper truth. Dante transcended Florence. His exile from one city made him a citizen of all cities. His loss of earthly home made him create a spiritual home that anyone can enter through reading his poem. The Divine Comedy is not Florentine. It's not even Italian, really. It's human. It's universal. It speaks to the condition of being lost, of being exiled from where you belong, of searching for meaning in a world that seems meaningless, of trying to find your way home. Everyone is exiled from somewhere. Everyone has lost something they can't get back. Everyone wanders in a dark wood at some point in their life. Dante's specific exile, his specific pain, his specific loss, these became symbols for universal human experience. This is what great art does. It takes the particular and makes it universal. It takes one man's suffering and transforms it into everyone's suffering. It takes one story and makes it the story. Dante never went home to Florence, but he went home to God, at least in his poem. And in doing that, he showed everyone else the way home. Not to any earthly city, but to the source of all being, all truth, all love. This is his legacy. Not that he described hell accurately, or that he invented terza rima, or that he created the Italian language, though he did all those things. His legacy is that he showed how suffering can be transformed into meaning, how exile can become pilgrimage, how loss can become finding. He lost everything. And from that loss, he created everything. He had no home. So he built 3 entire worlds. He had no political power. So he claimed divine authority. He had no justice on earth. So he imagined perfect justice in eternity. And the poem he wrote in his exile has been read continuously for 700 years. It has never gone out of print. It has never been forgotten. Scholars still debate its meanings. Artists still draw its images. Writers still reference its lines. Florence may have exiled Dante, but Dante's poem exiled Florence from relevance. Without the Divine Comedy, Florence would be remembered as one medieval Italian city-state among many. Because of the Divine Comedy, Florence is the city of Dante forever. He won. The exile won. The homeless wanderer won. The bitter poet nursing his grievances won. He won because he transformed his pain into beauty, his anger into art, his loss into eternity. This is the final lesson of Dante's life. You can lose everything earthly and still win everything eternal. You can be stripped of home, property, family, reputation, and still create something that will outlast all those who stripped you. You can be condemned by your contemporaries and vindicated by history. But the victory is not without cost. Dante died in exile. He never saw Florence again. He never got political justice. He never got revenge in any normal sense. He only got the revenge of art. The revenge of being remembered when his enemies are forgotten. The revenge of being read when their names mean nothing. Is that enough? Was it worth it? Would Dante trade his immortality for a chance to go home? We can't know. But I think he knew, even as he wrote, that this was the trade he was making. Earthly home for eternal significance. Temporal justice for poetic justice. Belonging in Florence for belonging to the ages. He made that trade, he lived with it, he died with it, and 700 years later, we're still reading what he wrote. Here is what Dante understood that most of us forget. Suffering has structure. It's not random chaos. It's not meaningless pain. It follows patterns. It has architecture, and understanding that architecture is the first step toward redemption. This is what the three realms of the Divine Comedy really represent. Hell is suffering without hope, eternal and unchanging. Purgatory is suffering with purpose, temporary and transformative. Paradise is joy as the fulfillment of all longing, eternal and ever-increasing. Each realm has its own geometry, its own physics, its own rules. Hell is a pit descending into the earth, narrowing as it goes down, ending at the frozen point of absolute evil. Purgatory is a mountain rising into the sky, broadening as you climb, ending at the garden where humanity began. Paradise is a series of expanding spheres, growing in light and love, ending in the infinite point that contains everything. The geometry tells you the theology. In hell, things get worse as you go deeper. Everything narrows, darkens, freezes. In purgatory, things get better as you go higher. The path is steep, but you're climbing toward light. In paradise, everything expands, becomes more spacious, more luminous, more joyful. And the crucial difference between hell and purgatory is not the presence or absence of suffering. Souls suffer in both places. The difference is hope. In hell, suffering is permanent and meaningless. In purgatory, suffering is temporary and meaningful. It's chosen. It's transformative. It has an end. This distinction is profound. Dante is saying that what makes suffering unbearable is not the pain itself, but the hopelessness. Pain with purpose can be endured, even embraced. Pain without purpose destroys the soul. The souls in purgatory are in some ways suffering more than souls in the upper circles of hell. But they're happier because they know why they're suffering, and they know it will end. They chose this suffering. They want to be purified. They're willing to pay the cost of their sins because the alternative is worse, staying stained, staying unfit for God, staying incomplete. This is a radical vision of suffering. Dante is not saying that suffering is good. He's saying that suffering accepted willingly in pursuit of transformation is different from suffering imposed as punishment. The same fire can purify or torture, depending on whether you walk into it freely or are thrown into it against your will. And this transforms how we think about earthly suffering. If purgatory is real, if suffering can be transformative, if pain can serve spiritual growth, then maybe earthly suffering isn't just something to avoid or minimize. Maybe it can be used, maybe it can be embraced, maybe it can become the very means of your transformation. This is what the saints understood. This is what martyrs knew. This is what mystics discovered. Suffering, rightly received, opens you to grace. It breaks down your ego defenses. It destroys your illusions of self-sufficiency. It makes you humble, compassionate, aware of your need for God. But, and this is crucial, Dante is not saying all suffering is good, or that God wants us to suffer. The suffering in hell is not redemptive. It doesn't purify anyone. It just torments them forever. The suffering in purgatory is redemptive precisely because it's temporary, chosen and ordered toward the goal of seeing God. The difference is whether suffering leads anywhere or just goes in circles. Hell is circular, repetitive, eternal. The same torment forever. The same pain without end or meaning. Purgatory is linear, progressive, purposeful. You climb, you change, you move towards something better. And paradise is neither circular nor linear. It's expansive. It's simultaneously rest and movement. The souls don't climb anymore because they've arrived. But they're always moving deeper into God, always discovering more, always experiencing greater joy. This is Dante's vision of the spiritual life. You start in hell, or at least in the dark wood that borders hell. You're lost. You're suffering without understanding why. You're going in circles. You can't find your way out. Then something intervenes, grace, represented by Beatrice. And you begin the journey through hell. You have to see suffering clearly. You have to understand how sin destroys. You have to confront the consequences of wrong choices. You can't skip this. You can't pretend evil doesn't exist or that choices don't matter. You have to go through hell to get to purgatory. Then you climb. You choose to suffer for your purification. You willingly embrace the pain that will transform you. You become active in your own redemption rather than passive. And this climbing, this chosen suffering, this active engagement with your own transformation, this is what makes you capable of paradise. And when you finally arrive, when you finally see God, you discover that everything you went through, every pain, every struggle, every moment of darkness was leading you here. It all had meaning. It all had purpose. It was all part of the journey home. This is the architecture of redemption. It has a shape. It has a structure. It's not random. And understanding the structure gives you hope when you're in the dark wood. Because if there's a structure, then there's a way through. If there's a map, then you're not hopelessly lost. If others have made this journey, then you can make it too. Dante gave us that map. He drew it in poetry. He made it beautiful so we would remember it. He made it detailed so we could follow it. He made it real so we could believe in it. And 700 years later, people are still using his map, still reading his poem, still finding their way through hell to purgatory, to paradise, by following Dante's path. What Dante accomplished has never been repeated. No one has written a comprehensive poetic vision of the afterlife that became the cultural standard for an entire civilization. No one has created a poem so influential that it invented a language, shaped theology, influenced politics, and haunted the imagination of every subsequent generation. The Divine Comedy stands alone, not because it's the best poem ever written, though many would argue it is, but because it's the most complete, the most comprehensive, the most successful at what it attempts to do. Dante tried to contain everything, all human knowledge, all divine truth, all earthly history and eternal destiny, science and theology, philosophy and politics, personal grudges and cosmic justice, the depths of hell and the heights of heaven, everything, and somehow, impossibly, it works. The poem holds together. It doesn't collapse under its own weight. It doesn't become a mere catalogue or encyclopedia. It remains poetry. It remains art. It remains art. It remains beautiful. How did he do it? Partly through structure, the mathematical precision, the symbolic numbers, the architectural clarity. These give the poem a skeleton that can support enormous weight, partly through narrative. The journey motif keeps you moving. You're not just learning theology, you're following Dante as he descends, climbs, and rises. You want to know what happens next. You care about his transformation, partly through character. The souls Dante meets are vivid, memorable, fully realized. Paolo and Francesca, Ulysses, Ugolino, Beatrice. Even minor characters who appear for a few lines feel real, substantial, unforgettable, partly through language. Dante's Italian is simultaneously precise and soaring. He can describe technical points of theology and create moments of transcendent beauty. He can be crude and sublime, often in the same canto. But mostly, I think, it works because Dante believed in it completely. This is not an academic exercise for him. This is not showing off his learning or his poetic skill. This is his life, his actual understanding of reality, his genuine attempt to make sense of suffering, evil, love, justice, God. He stakes everything on this poem, his reputation, his legacy, his soul. He's not playing, he's not performing, he's testifying. And that authenticity, that absolute seriousness, that complete commitment, this is what makes the poem powerful. You feel that Dante means it. You sense that he's telling you what he really believes, what he really saw, what he really understands. And this is why the poem still matters 700 years later. Not because medieval cosmology is true. It's not. We know the Earth isn't at the center of the universe. We know the planetary spheres don't exist physically. We know, or most of us know, that hell isn't literally under our feet. But the poem matters because Dante understood human nature. He understood how pride destroys, how lust enslaves, how violence degrades, how fraud corrupts. He understood how suffering can either destroy you or transform you depending on how you receive it. He understood that justice requires consequences, and that love requires transformation, and that the deepest human longing is for God, whether we know it or not. These truths don't age. They don't become obsolete. Every generation discovers them anew. And every generation finds those truths in Dante's poem, sometimes for the first time, sometimes again and again. The Divine Comedy is an inexhaustible text. You can read it at 20 and again at 40 and again at 60 and discover different things each time. It meets you where you are. When you're young, you're fascinated by the horror of hell. When you're middle-aged, you understand the need for purgatory. When you're old, you hope for paradise. The poem grows with you because it contains everything. All stages of life, all types of sin, all modes of redemption, all levels of understanding. You never outgrow it. You never finish with it. It's always there, waiting to reveal something new. This is what makes a classic. Not just that it's old or that people say you should read it, but that it continues to be read, continues to be meaningful, continues to change lives. Generation after generation, readers discover Dante. They follow him through the dark wood. They descend into hell with him. They climb Mount Purgatory. They rise toward heaven, and they're transformed by the journey, and they come back different. They see differently. They understand suffering differently. They think about justice and love and God differently. The poem does to them what the journey did to Dante. It reorders their loves. It purifies their desires. It points them toward what's ultimate. This is why Dante matters. Not because he wrote a famous poem, but because he wrote a poem that saves souls, or tries to, or believes it can. And in believing that poetry could save souls, he created poetry that actually does, in its way, save them. Not mechanically, not magically, not magically, not magically, but by showing them the architecture of redemption, by giving them a map through the dark wood, by proving that the journey from lostness to belonging is possible. Dante made that journey. Lost, exiled, homeless, bitter Dante. He started in the dark wood and ended seeing God. He descended into hell and rose to heaven. He lost everything earthly and gained everything eternal. And then he wrote it all down so we could follow him. That's his gift to us. The map, the poem, the vision of how suffering becomes meaning, how exile becomes pilgrimage, how lost becomes found. 700 years later, we're still reading it, still following the path, still making the journey from the dark wood to the stars. And that, finally, is what it means to be Dante. To take your deepest pain and transform it into universal truth. To take your bitterest experience and make it beautiful. To take your exile and turn it into everyone's homecoming. He never went home to Florence, but he built a home for the human spirit that will last as long as there are humans who can read, who can imagine, who can hope that suffering has meaning and that love moves the sun and the other stars. That home is the Divine Comedy, and its doors are open to anyone willing to enter the dark wood and begin the journey.